invested programs. They spent a lot of money and a lot of time telling people some things that aren't true. And so it's hard for them. Like the belief that every accident is preventable is cute and always true in retrospect, but never true in context. Well, if every accident was preventable, then people would prevent every accident. But in fact, not every accident is preventable because accidents are really hard to predict. So you have to sort of tell the behavioral-based safety people that as great as this sounds, the bottom line is you really don't know what will fail next, and your system is complex enough that you really can't predict with any great accuracy. Then you have to tell them that this belief that somehow the worker is the key, if you just make the worker better, if the worker made better choices or better decisions or did less at-risk behaviors, which I don't even really know what that means. That's totally kind of a made-up at-risk behavior. I mean, everything, if it fails, was risky. And there's risk in everything you do. So at-risk seems like a terribly sort of normative, retrospective value to put on a worker. And you'd mostly put it on the worker after it fails. But if workers made better decisions, you'd have better outcomes. Well, it's really important to help them understand that that's fundamentally just not true. I mean, they got sold a load of hay, but it's kind of like the Heinrich model. I mean, safety people are really, we're desperate to find some kind of predictive data. And so we'll buy anything. We'll buy the Heinrich model. We'll buy it for 60 years. We'll believe truly that the lower level events control the higher level events, which is just completely wrong.
And that was the interesting part, because I will tell you with behavior-based safety, I found videos online where they reference that if you have a more professional worker, they should not be injured, which I find amazing that that's even listed.
It's wrong and it's malpractice. And the thing about it is that it's ethically really a shitty thing to do to a worker.
Absolutely, because it says you're not intelligent enough, you're not smart enough, you have not done enough work in the background on how we should be trained to be able to move forward with this.
Right. If you'd have tried harder, you wouldn't have gotten hurt. That's what we tell people all the time.
Absolutely. And then I will tell you, I was a big cheerleader. I worked for a pretty big transportation company that they believed 329 and 1. And I was a cheerleader, and I was like, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense, because there's some people that have been injured, but they didn't die and they didn't do anything stupid prior. So how did this happen? That's
a hard battle, because that's really ingrained. I mean, people really believe that. So you have to be kind of so I'm probably, I was probably a good personality type to do this, because I'm this huge guy, right? And I don't really take anything seriously, and almost nothing threatens me because, I'm not really that threatened. And I come out of an academic background, and I worked at a national laboratory. So I'm really used to really smart people calling me on my stuff. I mean, they'll say, where's the citation for that? Own that, And because I have a PhD, I know how to do research, and I know how to gather data and build a research question. I know how to do all that stuff. I mean, that's what I know how to do, right? But I was able to sort of stand up against some pretty strong people and say, ultimately, the emperor doesn't have any clothes on. I mean, this is a really interesting idea, but it's wrong. And the bottom line is that really what we're talking about is an argument between the notion of free will. Do workers have free agency? Do they exercise free will in the workplace? And predeterminism. Are workers part of a larger system? And the answer, is not one or the other. That's pretty much why the Reformation happened. We're not going to answer that on a podcast. But somewhere in there, you have to say, if we take extreme views one way or the other, we're probably in trouble. Workers don't really exercise free agency. And workers really are part of a bigger system. There's lots of pressures on workers, production and peer and all sorts of pressures that create a system that allow the workers to function. And what we want to manage, this is the big switch, is that this next move into safety, the change isn't really at the worker level. It's not at the coalface level. So now you got a program that you don't have to roll out to every driver in a transportation company. But you do have to roll it out to the senior leadership and to every leader in the transportation company. And you have to say to them, look, error is normal. Blame fixes nothing. Learning is vital. And that how you react to a system colors how the system moves forward. The type of questions you ask color the answers you get.
And that's the thing. I think that sometimes it's just trying to do change of that mindset in regards of the leadership of a company is very difficult for them to go, well, why aren't we implementing this? Why are we not looking at X, Y, and Z that we looked at before? And how do we change that going forward? How are these systems going to work? And it's always difficult to have those conversations.
Yeah, and it's scary. That's scary to them because they're giving up what's taken them so far. And there's a certain amount of sunk cost. We put a lot of money in our BBS program, although that's kind of going away. I mean, the thing about BBS is that I think people are starting to realize that behavioral-based safety is time intensive and it's pretty much financial intensive in most cases. It doesn't need to be, but most people buy a program. And we track a lot of stuff, but the stuff we track isn't very predictive and really isn't very important. So we have these big tracking systems where we measure stuff, but it's not very predictive and it doesn't help us. So we're measuring for the sake of measuring. But we got a really, really screwed up relationship with metrics anyway. And that's really more of a function of the fact that we can't define what safety is. And safety is hard to define. There's no question about it. I love what Eric Hollnagel calls safety. He says safety is a dynamic non-event. So, and that's a pretty good way to define safety. But man, that's really, really academic. That's going to be hard to take and say a truck driver. Safety is what happens when nothing happens. That's pretty hard.
I mean, you almost look at it from an engineering standpoint. If an engineer is not really doing anything, that's a good sign. If they're working on something, that normally means you have a problem.
Yeah, that's probably a good way to look at it. And then you look at resilience and all that stuff. It's a pretty sexy. I mean, it's definitely an interesting way to see the world. And it's fun because it's kind of on the cutting edge of thinking right now. So that's fun. And it's fun because it really does challenge really old, very almost permanently ingrained notions of what safe is. And it's fun because companies get better. I mean, the thing that I would tell you is that organizations that take the view that the worker is not the problem, the worker is the solution, get better. I just worked with, in fact, yesterday I was at a place where they've had a lot of fatalities with people who do really high risk work. They trim trees. And I don't know if you know much about the logging industry, but you're 56 times more likely to die in that job than any other job in the world. It is the most dangerous job in the world, right? And for a long time, they just asked people not to fall off trees. Just don't fall. Don't fall. Do not fall. Well, if you go to a construction project, a big construction site where they're doing ironwork, they don't ask steel workers to not fall. They tell steel workers to wear a harness. So they're not trying to control the presence of the fall. They just assume there's a 100% chance somebody's going to fall today. And when they fall, what they want to manage is their ability to fail safely, to have a margin of maneuverability. And that becomes really important as well.
And that is the best way to look at it. And to answer your previous question, no, I'm not very familiar with the logging industry, but that sounds like a very high risk. I guess
they should be on your podcast, man. You should go out and find a logger.
It's very difficult to find that in Florida, but I will probably have to work on that, see how I can come up with that.
Actually, I bet you Florida, because of the pulp and paper industry, I bet you Florida has a lot of people involved in logging. I bet that's not hard, actually.
Okay, well, I'll have to take a look at it, and I'll tell you I'm in the...
Not to call you. I'm not calling you out.
I'm fine with it.
I'm just telling you, Florida is a very amazing state to me. First of all, it's really... Anything that happens that's freaky in the world happens in Florida. You live in a state where the murderer also murdered someone else and then murdered someone else, but got away with the first two murders until the third murder when they found that all three murders were... I'm just like, wow, that has to be Florida. Or people wear clown costumes and kill... I mean, it's just like, wow, that's Florida. We don't have that in New Mexico.
Well, I'll tell you, it's much different here in Florida. I was lucky or blessed enough a few weeks ago to actually be in New Mexico, and I was out in the Taos area, and it's night and day difference between Florida and New Mexico for sure.
You should have not left, man. You should have just stayed in the Taos area.
Oh, I was trying to convince my wife that we should stay there. We went and visited some Earthship thing, and it was very interesting.
Oh, yeah, those are cool. Aren't those cool? Did you go on the tour, though?
Oh, no. We stayed in them. We stayed in for 2 days. It was very interesting. So I loved it. I was.
Did they have the solar toilets or the real toilets?
They had the real toilets because I didn't want one of those compost toilets.
The solar toilet is an idea that probably works in theory, but does not really lend itself to practicality that much. You got a big black disc full of poop that you keep turning in the sun, and at some point you think, there's probably a better way to do this. Oh, that's why they invented toilets.
Yeah, it would almost feel like you're cooking the poop to some extent, wouldn't it?
You are. No, it's not almost. That's what you're doing. You're cooking it. You're baking it.
Well, I have to ask you, I want to ask you a couple questions real quick. I am an avid listener to the Pre-Accident Investigation podcast. During your first podcast, and I know this was many years back, you said that you were doing the podcast out of guilt. Do you still feel that way?
Yeah, there's a certain amount. You'll see as you get into this, there's a certain amount of obligation to podcast. And the reason is, and you know this because you have a background in broadcasting, is that the thing that makes a podcast successful is really a couple things. One is that it's regular, that they can count on the fact that on Wednesdays at noon and on Saturdays at noon, there's a new episode. So that's really important. So that's a commitment right there. Two is that it needs to be short enough that it's manageable in small bites and not boring. I mean, I would try to work really hard to make it not boring. And then three, it has to have some value. Those three things are not easy to manage simultaneously, but you have to manage them. So I was probably getting some drama points by saying it was guilt, but there's definitely a sense of obligation. It seems like a good thing to do. At least with Pre-Accident, a lot of people listen to it. So, you get, I don't know how many hits you get, but I get a couple thousand a day downloads. So it's definitely got some impact, and you hear people talk about it. I mean, I think a lot of people listen to it. It's interesting to me, and this will be something interesting to kind of watch on your podcast too, is the primary audience is probably safety people, but the biggest audience, the loudest audience, the audience that writes the most comments are high performance computing people. So it really kind of jumps across industries. So my podcast, there's lots of safety people, lots of computing people, lots of aviation people, lots and lots of aviation people, lots of government people. And then mine has lots of legs internationally. So I have a lot of listeners in Europe and a bunch of listeners in like Australia, New Zealand, that part of the world.
Yes, I will tell you, I have pulled up some of your rankings, and I was amazed on how yours is actually worldwide in regards to the audience that you actually have. And I mean, there's so much information on your podcast that I was impressed that, that you have different countries going on to it, and that's great. And I was like, how does it, translate in regard to some of the information? Because I know that here in the States, we have specific government authorities will put that you have to do things within. And I was wondering, how does that actually work when you get into the larger markets?
So pretty seamless. I mean, everybody's kind of fighting the same battle, and governments are moving in different rates, but they're all moving towards this direction, towards this new understanding of how safety is. And that's going to be it's a function of just that. What's changed safety is not the industrial safety events. It's not sprained ankles and cut hands. What's changed safety is the fact that really, really safe organizations with really, really good behavioral-based safety programs, or really, really good industrial safety programs anywhere in the world still kill people. And so the interesting thing about that is that the tools we use to manage catastrophic failure are way different than the tools we use to manage ankle sprain. And so now the whole world is saying, because the bar's changed, right? What's acceptable has changed. The whole world is saying, hey, it's no longer appropriate to be the safest company in the world and kill 11 people. We want to be the safest company in the world and not kill 11 people. And so they start looking at fatalities much different. And that's a topic for a whole nother podcast. That's really, between you and I, what I'm most interested in is fatalities, catastrophic failure, because the tools we use in traditional safety are not tools that help keeping people from dying, because fatalities live in successful work. They don't live in at-risk behaviors. They live in successful work, usually pretty complex successful work, that workers are in a position where they have to make trade-offs, and those trade-offs normally work. Make sense?
It makes sense. And I will tell you, I was watching one of your presentations that was online, and you had made a similar reference in regards of the things that will actually cause an ankle sprain will not be the same things that would kill someone.
Right.
And I heard that.
And that's really
that's genius. That's
so simple, right? I mean, that's the simplest thing in the world, is basically what I say is the things that hurt people aren't the same things that kill people. And I only know that just because I have to go and look at lots of fatalities. So I help lots of companies out with fatalities. And I'm always really surprised that the things that hurt people, the things they really care about, aren't the things that actually kill people.
That's very true. Now, I want to ask you